About Sponsorship in AA, written by John S. and posted at weagnosticsaa.org on October 19th, 2014. When I was a newcomer, I was under constant pressure to get a sponsor. In meetings, people would often share tidbits of advice they received from their sponsor. They would claim one couldn't work the program without a sponsor. And there were those who proudly described drill sergeant sponsors who straightened them out on one thing or another. I would squirm in my seat because I didn't have a sponsor and I was too shy to get the courage to even ask. I would rather just attend meetings, and if I needed to talk to someone privately about a particular situation, there could always be any number of people who I trusted and with whom I was comfortable talking. Yet some people were absolutely relentless with applying the pressure. A typical conversation would go something like this. "Do you have a sponsor?" "No," I'd reply. "Why not?" they would ask. "Oh, I don't know. I guess I just haven't got to it." And with that, the person would proclaim in a smug tone that they couldn't work the program without a sponsor, suggesting in a kind of passive-aggressive way that I wasn't working the program because I didn't have a sponsor. This would continue until I finally broke down and got a sponsor. I have to admit that my overall experience with sponsorship has been positive, both as a sponsor and as one who has been sponsored. My first sponsor was kind and supportive and was happy that I was staying sober and going to meetings. He never asked me to do anything more than that. I went through the first 3 steps with my second sponsor, who saw me through some difficult times. I learned a lot from him, and it was a great experience. The third sponsor took me through steps 4 and 5, and the next helped me with steps 6 through 9. I try to incorporate steps 10 through 12 in my life, but never formally went through those steps with a sponsor. The person who sponsors me now came along late in sobriety, but has been my sponsor for the longest period of time, going on for 15 years. I don't call him very often, but I do consider him a friend, and I would do anything for him if he needed help, and I know he would always be there for me. I do, however, have a few words of advice for the newcomer when it comes to selecting a sponsor, and ironically, one piece of advice is to be very wary of advice. At any rate, here's my advice for what it's worth. 1. Don't rush. There is no urgency. If you're going to meetings, sharing honestly, getting involved with the fellowship, making friends, and not drinking, then you are doing just fine. 2. Choose someone who is already in your circle of friends, someone you know well. 3. Watch out for the person who is overconfident, that seems to have all the answers, and isn't shy about giving advice. 4. Stay away from anyone who suggests there's something wrong with how you think. Never let anyone else think for you. 5. Remember that sponsorship is a relationship between equals. Your sponsor has no authority over you. If they try to exert authority, it's perfectly okay to change sponsors. 6. If you're a woman, do not choose a male sponsor. And if you're a man, don't select a woman for a sponsor. So how did sponsorship ever come about anyway? Sponsorship is an AA tradition tracing its origins back to Cleveland, Ohio in the early 1940s, when the only other AA groups were located in Akron and New York. Cleveland was unlike the other 2 groups, where Dr. Bob and Bill W. directly transmitted the AA message to others. Instead, Cleveland relied on the newly published book, Alcoholics Anonymous, which emphasized the importance of working with others. There was also a great influx of newcomers in Cleveland, thanks to the publicity surrounding the sobering up of a well-known professional baseball player. But before these newcomers could attend a meeting, their sponsor had to vouch for them. Here's a description of early sponsorship from the book, Not God, A History of Alcoholics Anonymous by Ernest Kurtz. This is from the recollection of Warren C., who was sponsored by Clarence S., an early member of the Cleveland group. Clarence gave me a copy of the manuscript of the Big Book. We had to read it before we could go to a meeting. In order to go to a meeting, you had to qualify. Your sponsor judged whether you were sincere or not. And Clarence insisted on 2 things that were necessary. You had to want AA above everything else in the world, and you had to know something about it. No, it didn't come easy. It doesn't come easy. And well, in the early days, the companionship was so important. The new sober friends. We had to be sure. Yeah, we were fixing other drunks, but only because we had to fix ourselves. So we made sure everybody wanted what we wanted. Now, that might sound harsh, or it might sound like humility. All I know is we wanted to be sober, and we were scared. And so we did what we had told to do. That was surrender. You did what your sponsor told you to do. No arguments, no questions. You just did it, or you got drunk again. And so by God, we did it. It makes sense. In order to keep it, you have to give it away. And you wouldn't want to waste your effort on someone who doesn't want it. It was important for those newcomers in the early days to be sponsored by more experienced members who can guarantee that the newcomer does in fact want sobriety. Let's take a look at sponsorship today and the official conference-approved word on the subject. The official AA description of sponsorship can be found in the pamphlet titled, "What is Sponsorship?" Essentially, the process of sponsorship is this. An alcoholic who has made some progress in the recovery program shares that experience on a continuous individual basis with another alcoholic who is attempting to attain or maintain sobriety through AA. The pamphlet breaks with the past and makes it clear that the only requirement for membership in AA is a desire to stop drinking, and one does not need a sponsor to vouch for them before attending meetings. Instead, sponsorship is described as a relationship among equals, as illustrated by the example of Bill W. and Dr. Bob. Bill carried the message to Bob, who in turn sponsored many others, but the two men sustained one another. Neither was in a position of authority over the other. I always assumed sponsorship was simply a custom and not something essential to recovery. So I was surprised at how strongly the pamphlet promoted sponsorship, urging newcomers not to delay asking someone to be their sponsor and describing sponsorship as a long-lasting relationship and a basic part of the AA approach to recovery from alcoholism through the 12 steps. It also suggests that in many successful groups, sponsorship is one of the most important planned activities of the members. The Q&A section of the pamphlet brings up a few items that I found interesting and deserving worthy of commentary. The pamphlet suggests that a newcomer should choose a sponsor who seems to be using the AA program successfully in everyday life and has been sober for at least 1 year. It's recommended to, quote, stick with the winners. But how does someone who's new to AA and has never gone through the 12 steps have any idea whether or not a person is, quote, working the program and is not in fact a wolf in sheep's clothing? For this reason, I don't think one should rush into getting a sponsor. Take it easy. Be careful. I do agree with the suggestion that sponsors and the sponsored should be of the same sex. And I think it's worth noting the problem of 13th stepping, which is when an older, more experienced member takes advantage of a newcomer for sexual purposes. There is also a reminder to newcomers that they need not agree with their sponsor on everything. And if they hear an idea that seems strange, they should ask questions. I have heard of sponsors telling people not to take medication for depression or other mental illness. This is completely inappropriate. Don't listen to anyone in AA who is giving advice as to what medication you should or should not take. This is very important. It's interesting that the pamphlet cautions an atheist sponsor against trying to persuade a religious newcomer to leave their faith, or for a religious sponsor to argue theology with an agnostic newcomer. It's also very clear not to force a person to accept a specific interpretation of AA, as it's entirely possible to achieve and maintain sobriety without a personal higher power. If a newcomer resists the spirituality of AA, it is suggested that the sponsor remember that AA doesn't offer material or physical help. We only offer ideas and the love of one AA for another. This is a broad view of spirituality that almost anyone can accept. Sponsorship can be a helpful and healthy experience, but don't allow others to pressure you into it. Just take your time, take it easy, and proceed with caution, and you can have a safe, happy, and productive experience with